The Trump administration is making a renewed push to find a solution to the war in Syria. The man at the center of that effort is the newly appointed Special Representative for Syria Engagement, Ambassador James Schifrin. He sat down with Foreign Affairs correspondent Nick Schifrin, who sets the scene at a possible turning point for U.S. policy.
For months, President Trump has warned he would leave Syria.
I want to get out. I want to bring our troops back home. I want to start rebuilding our nation.
But now he's authorized an open-ended deployment and a more assertive strategy. U.S. troops and allied Syrian forces are fighting the final battle in Syria against ISIS. Following a Russian-Turkish agreement to pause the battle for Idlib, the rebels' final stronghold located in northwest Syria, the U.S. is pushing a political solution. And it's adding a difficult new goal: evict tens of thousands of Iranian-backed troops inside Syria, as Ambassador James Schifrin reluctantly acknowledged in New York.
Will the U.S. stay in Syria until Iranian troops leave Syria? And is that an expansion of the mission of defeating ISIS?
The mission to defeat ISIS by the U.S. military remains the enduring defeat of ISIS, why our U.S. military forces are in Syria. But we, the United States, are in Syria with our allies, with our local forces, to try to do three things that the President laid out here. First of all, we want to de-escalate this conflict, and we were really encouraged by the Turkish-Russian agreement that stopped the march on Idlib by the Syrian forces backed by the Russians. You will remember 2 weeks ago the President declared publicly that this would be a reckless escalation of the conflict.
If it's a slaughter, the world is going to get very, very angry, and the United States is going to get very angry too.
Everybody took that seriously. Based upon that, the President is calling for a de-escalation of the military situation. So de-escalate the military conflict while reinvigorate the political process that will bring this war to a close and allow the half the population driven from their homes to come back and to have some kind of regional peace order again. So that's what we're working on now.
But if I could ask again, National Security Advisor came out this week and said U.S. troops won't leave until Iranians or their proxies leave Syria. Is that an expansion of the mission for U.S. troops in Syria?
I'm not going to contradict the National Security Advisor.
So does that mean that U.S. troops will remain in Syria?
The U.S. troops right now have the mission of defeating and ensuring the enduring defeat of ISIS. The U.S. as a whole will be staying on in one or another way. There are many examples of how you can be present, including present with somebody's military forces without having American boots on the ground. In some cases, you have American boots on the ground.
And regardless of whether it's boots, one of their missions, whether it's diplomats or whether it's proxies that the U.S. uses or allies, will be to evict Iran from Syria. Is that right?
The goal of the United States in Syria, as the President laid out, is first, the enduring defeat of ISIL, what our troops are doing there. Second, the removal of all Iranian commanded forces from the entirety of Syria. Third, a irreversible political process, which is what we've really, we think, been advancing here with the entire international community with this UN process under Staffan de Mistura, the UN envoy.
Can there be an irreversible political process with Bashar al-Assad staying in power?
We're not in the business of regime change. We're in the business of setting conditions. First of all, it has to be a Syrian process. The enduring political solution under the UN process and the UN resolution calls for the Syrian people to make that decision, including by a free election that the UN would supervise and ensure is fair and free, including the diaspora, a good third of the population that's been driven out of Syria. And what they conclude, we don't know, but it's hard for us to imagine that it would be a regime like that Bashar al-Assad currently is in charge of.
And one of the conditions, of course, that you want is for refugees to feel free to go home. Can they really feel free to go home if Assad is still the president?
Well, most of them have already voted with their feet or voted with their posteriors by sitting exactly where they are, because nobody, or not nobody,
meaning outside of Syria.
Right, outside of Syria, because no one wants to return to be subject to the extraordinary torture chambers, poison gas, and absolute disgraceful barrel bombing oppression of that regime.
And there have been peace talks, of course, as you know, in Geneva for many years. How do you get Syria and Russia to take serious these peace talks and the momentum toward a political solution that you're talking about, when frankly they haven't taken it seriously in the past?
You're right. First of all, we now have, at least for the moment, with the Idlib agreement between Turkey and Russia, you now have what amounts to a military stalemate. Thanks to the Idlib situation, that's something new. Secondly, we have said no reconstruction assistance, no assistance to encourage or force refugees back and help rebuild the regime for Assad until we see a political process in place. And thirdly, you've got these 5 outside military forces rubbing against each other with risk of escalation, as we saw with the shoot-down of the Russian aircraft by Syrian forces trying to go after the Israelis who had just bombed an Iranian target. That's a nightmare scenario that I think encourages everybody to turn to the political process that we are reinvigorating here this week in New York.
Ambassador James Schifrin, thank you very much.
Thank you.